Okay, I think we're done.
Okay.
This year marks 100 years since the first woman swam across the English Channel, and it's prompted articles and well-deserved recognition. However, it's shone a light for me on how little I know about the women who shaped the sport that I now call home.
Adele going in for the final stretch.
I crossed the English Channel in 2024. It took me just over 15 hours and it remains the hardest physical challenge I've undertaken to date. Like many channel swimmers, I came away with a deep respect for the stretch of water itself, the tide, the cold, the shipping lanes, the sheer unpredictability of it all. Completing the crossing felt like joining a very small club. But afterwards, I found myself becoming increasingly interested in the people who had crossed before me. The more I read, the more I realised that the history of the English Channel isn't simply the story of one famous swim. It's also the story of how women have repeatedly challenged assumptions about endurance, often long before science or society was willing to catch up. When Gertrude Ederle stepped into the English Channel in 1926, she wasn't the first woman to attempt the crossing. Several had tried before her. She was, however, the first to succeed. And she hadn't just become the first woman to swim the channel, she'd beaten the existing men's record by almost 2 hours. It wasn't simply a landmark in swimming history. It challenged long-held assumptions about women's athletic ability.
Now, I've never really stopped to consider what that meant. Not because I underestimated Gertrude Ederle's achievement, but certainly if in 1926 the first female channel swimmer had rewritten the expectations, why do we still talk about women in endurance sport as an exception rather than the rule?
Over the last century, women have continued to push the boundaries of what's thought possible in open water swimming. They have crossed further, stayed in colder water, broken records, challenged conventions, and, in many cases, changed our understanding of endurance itself. Yet outside the swimming community, many of their stories remain remarkably unfamiliar. This isn't a history of the English Channel, nor is it a list of remarkable swims. It's an attempt to understand what began 100 years ago and why the legacy of those women reaches far beyond 34 kilometres of water between England and France. In the early 20th century, the English Channel had become one of the greatest prizes in endurance sport. It was close enough to be imaginable, yet difficult enough to defeat even the strongest swimmers. Cold water, shifting tides, and heavy shipping meant success depended on far more than speed alone. Every attempt became a public test of endurance. By this point, women had been competing in organised swimming for decades, but opportunities remained limited, and ideas about female physiology often rested more on convention than evidence. Doctors warned that strenuous exercise could damage women's health. Newspapers questioned whether they possessed the strength or resilience needed for prolonged endurance events, and the English Channel became one of the clearest expressions of that belief. Several women attempted the crossing, but none had yet succeeded.
It's easy to read these opinions and see them as outdated, but at the time they weren't controversial, they were accepted knowledge, which is why Gertrude Ederle's swim was so impactful.
By the time Ederle arrived in France in 1925, she was already one of the most accomplished swimmers in the world. She had learned to swim as a child in New York, despite losing much of her hearing following measles, and had gone on to win Olympic medals and break world records. If anyone seemed equipped to challenge the channel, It was Ederle. Her first attempt lasted almost 9 hours until a member of her support team entered the water and touched her, bringing the swim to an immediate close under the rules. Ederle maintained that she could have continued, so instead she returned home, changed coaches, and trained for another year to prepare to try again.
Something that strikes me whilst training for long distance swims is how little control you have over the outcome. You're training for months, sometimes even years, and a swim can end for some reason beyond your control, which is what makes swims like the English Channel that much more compelling as a challenge.
On the 6th of August 1926, Ederle entered the water at Cap Greenet. 14 hours and 31 minutes later, she reached Kingsdown on the Kent coast. She became the first woman to swim the English Channel, crossing almost 2 hours faster than the existing men's record. Newspapers around the world reported the achievement, and in New York, millions of people lined the streets to welcome her home. The first woman to swim the English Channel had become an international celebrity.
What interests me isn't just that Gertrude Ederle was the first, it's that her swim changed the whole discussion. Up until her swim, people debated whether or not a woman could swim across the English Channel, and afterwards, that argument became much harder to sustain.
Gertrude Ederle's crossing didn't end discrimination in sport, nor did it transform attitudes overnight, but it left behind evidence that was difficult to ignore. And over the century that followed, other women would return to the Channel, not simply to repeat Ederle's achievement, but to redefine it. In October 1927, just over a year after Ederle's crossing, Mercedes Gleitz became the first British woman to swim the English Channel. She completed the crossing from France to England in just over 15 hours. It should have been a straightforward success, but instead, within days, another woman falsely claimed to have completed the Channel. Although the claim was eventually exposed, it created uncertainty around women's Channel swims more broadly, including Gleitz's own achievement. Rather than simply defending herself in the press, Gleitz returned to the water. Her second attempt became known as the Vindication Swim. She did not reach France, but after more than 10 hours in the water, estimated at around 13 degrees Celsius, worsening conditions brought the swim to an end. She had not completed a second crossing, but she had demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that the first had been genuine. The controversy surrounding these early crossings helped shape the way English Channel swims would be recorded in the years that followed. Independent observers became an established part of attempts. Pilot logs documented every stage of a crossing. Clear rules developed around what constituted a successful swim. And over time, organisations, including the Channel Swimming Association, formalised many of these practices, creating standards that continue to underpin channel swimming today. That attention to detail is one reason the history of the English Channel is so unusually well documented. Every crossing contributes to a record stretching back more than a century. As confidence in those records grew, attention turned away from whether women belonged in the Channel and towards what they could achieve there. In 1950, Florence Chadwick became the first woman to swim the Channel in either direction. 4 years later, she crossed from France to England in 13 hours and 20 minutes, taking more than an hour from Gertrude Ederle's record. The standard had changed. Completing the Channel was still an extraordinary feat, but the next ambition was already taking shape: to go faster.
When Florence Chadwick swam across the English Channel, she was extending the line that Gertrude Ederle had started. And that's the thing. Every single swim builds upon the last, testing the same stretch of water to see what's possible.
By the 1980s, another name had become almost synonymous with the English Channel. Alison Streeter completed 43 Channel crossings between 1982 and 2004, more than anyone in history at the time. Yet even that statistic only tells part of the story. Beyond the Channel, Streeter also became one of the few swimmers to complete a solo circumnavigation of the Isle of Wight, a swim many regard as technically more demanding because of its distance, tides, and constantly changing conditions. But it raises an interesting question. Why is it the English Channel, rather than swims like the Isle of Wight, that continues to capture the public imagination? Perhaps because the channel has never been just another stretch of water, for more than a century it has been the place where endurance swimming measures itself. Each generation has encountered the English Channel differently. Gertrude Ederle proved a woman could cross it. Mercedes Gleitz have established the importance of proving that a crossing had happened at all. Florence Chadwick demonstrated that success could be measured not only by completion, but by performance. Alison Streeter showed that what had once been considered extraordinary could become the work of a lifetime. And the benchmark has kept moving, not because swimming the English Channel has become easier, because every swimmer left it slightly different from the one they had inherited. And as performances have continued to improve, another question began to emerge. Were these swimmers simply exceptional individuals, or did their achievements reveal something more fundamental about human endurance? That question would lead researchers away from the shoreline and towards a growing body of scientific evidence that is still evolving today. By the beginning of the 21st century, women were no longer simply matching the achievements of the swimmers who had come before them. They were establishing records that no man had held. In September 2019, Sarah Thomas became the first person to swim the English Channel 4 times without stopping. She remained in the water for 54 hours and 10 minutes before returning to the English coast. 2 years later, Chloe McArdle completed her 44th solo crossing, surpassing Alison Streeter's record for the greatest number by any swimmer. And these are not just women's records, they are overall records. And they raise a question that extends well beyond the English Channel. Why do women appear to perform so well when endurance events become exceptionally long?
Now, if you spend enough time in endurance sport, you'll hear that women are better at it, which is a really compelling idea when you think of swimmers like Sarah Thomas and Chloe McArdle. But the records can tell us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why.
Across most conventional sporting distances, the fastest men remain faster than the fastest women. Differences in hemoglobin, muscle mass, and maximal oxygen uptake give elite male athletes a substantial advantage in events where speed and power are decisive. Across many established events, the difference between male and female world record performances remains around 8 to 12%. But as events become longer, the picture becomes more complicated. Studies of ultra-distance running suggest that the performance gap narrows as distance increases. At the same time, researchers have warned that these comparisons are difficult. Women still make up a much smaller proportion of competitors in many ultra-endurance events, making it difficult to separate physiological differences from differences in opportunity and participation. So the idea that women simply become better than men after a certain distance doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. There isn't a single point where the advantage suddenly changes hands. What the research does suggest is that some of the physiological characteristics, usually thought of as disadvantages, become less important as events become longer. One possible explanation lies in how the body produces energy. During prolonged exercise, women generally rely more heavily on fat as a fuel source and preserve carbohydrate stores for longer. Researchers have also identified differences in muscle composition, with women tending to have a greater proportion of fatigue-resistant, slow-twitch muscle fibers. None of these characteristics make someone a better endurance athlete on its own, but over 20, 30, or 50 hours, small differences in efficiency can accumulate. Pacing may also play a role. Across several endurance sports, women have been observed to adopt steadier pacing strategies, while men are more likely to slow significantly later in an event. Whether that reflects physiology, experience, or decision-making is less clear. The research cannot yet separate those influences with confidence.
In a long swim, patience isn't separate from performance. You can start off strong and then make decisions that cost you hours later. You want to be feeding on the start line well before you're hungry. You want to drink before you're thirsty. And ultimately, it can make the difference between whether or not you finish a channel swim or not.
Open water swimming introduces another factor: cold. On average, women carry a higher proportion of body fat than men, proving greater insulation and buoyancy. Both may prove beneficial in prolonged cold water swimming, but greater body fat can also increase drag, and individual responses to cold vary enormously. There is no single physiological advantage that explains success in the English Channel. There is another challenge. For much of the history of sports science, researchers were not studying female athletes in equal numbers. A major review published in 2014 found that only 39% of participants across leading sports medicine journals were women. Women were often excluded because hormonal fluctuations were considered an unnecessary complication. Instead of designing studies capable of accounting for those differences, researchers frequently chose to study men instead. That creates an obvious limitation. We're trying to understand why women perform so well in some of the longest events in sport using a body of research that for many years was built primarily around male athletes. There are still so many questions we can't answer with confidence. Many of these swimmers have achieved extraordinary things long before researchers began asking why they might have been so successful. None of these findings provides a complete explanation. Fat metabolism cannot explain tactics, muscle fibers cannot explain experience. Body composition cannot explain why one swimmer copes with cold water whilst another does not. And physiology alone cannot account for the decades in which women had fewer opportunities to compete, train, and be supported in endurance sport. The narrowing performance gap is unlikely to have one single cause. It is shaped by biology, preparation, opportunity, psychology, and the nature of the event itself.
And perhaps that's the most interesting conclusion, the fact that there isn't a single possible explanation. Ultra endurance rewards adaptability, pacing, judgment, and grit. And those are much harder to isolate in a laboratory than they are to be demonstrated in the English Channel.
The English Channel does not test one quality in isolation. Every crossing combines physiology, preparation, decision-making, and the ability to adapt to conditions that are constantly changing. A century after Gertrude Ederle's crossing, researchers are beginning to understand more about why women have achieved so much in the world's longest endurance events. But there still is no single explanation. Scientific research can help explain why certain athletes succeed. It cannot explain what it feels like to spend more than 2 days in open water. And for that, we have to turn to the swimmers themselves. In September 2019, almost a century after Gertrude Ederle first reached the English coast, Sarah Thomas entered the English Channel with an ambition that had never been achieved, not by a woman nor a man. In September 2019, Sarah Thomas became the first person to complete 4 consecutive crossings of the English Channel without leaving the water. The swim took just over 54 hours, and no one has repeated it. The achievement arrived 93 years after Gertrude Ederle's first crossing, and by then the question was no longer whether a woman could swim the English Channel, it was how far the limits of marathon swimming could be pushed. And when Chloe McArdle completed her 44th crossing of the English Channel, it wasn't the fastest nor the longest, but more successful crossings than any other swimmer has recorded. The record itself reflects years spent returning to the same body of water, not a single performance.
It's easy to focus on the records because they're measurable and they're the moments that make the headlines, but they only ever tell a small part of the story.
In 1926, Gertrude Ederle was one of only a handful of women attempting the English Channel, and today, women attempt English Channel crossings every season. Across open water swimming more widely, many events now report close to equal numbers of men and women on their start lines. For some, the ambition is a local 1-miler, and for others, it is massive challenges like the Ocean 7. The English Channel is no shorter than it was a century ago. Its tides remain unpredictable, its temperature still catches swimmers by surprise, and the challenge of the chop has changed very little. But who decides to take it on has. Not every swimmer standing on the beach is chasing a record. Most aren't. They're there for reasons that will never appear in the history books. To finish, to raise money, to mark a birthday, to keep a promise to themselves. Their names may never become as well known as Gertrude Ederle's or Sarah Thomas's, but they are part of the same story. A century ago, a woman entering the English Channel was news. Today we can celebrate that it is simply a part of marathon swimming.